When lightning strikes twice. The lighthouse beam swept across black water like a searchlight hunting ghosts. Marcus Rivera adjusted the lens mechanism with practiced hands, listening to the Atlantic wind howl through the keeper's quarters. 40 feet below. 23 years he'd maintained this beacon, and tonight felt different, charged with something more electric than the storm crackling overhead. Lightning split the sky, illuminating towering waves that crashed against the granite, cliffs with prehistoric fury. Marcus counted the seconds between flash and thunder, calculating distance out of habit. The storm was directly overhead now, turning his lighthouse into a lone finger pointing accusingly at the tempest. That's when he saw her. A figure tumbled, in the surf below, dark hair streaming like seaweed, arms fighting against currents that could crush fishing boats. Marcus grabbed his emergency rope and spotlight, cursing the arthritis in his knees as he descended the spiral staircase 3 steps at a time. The wind tried to rip the lighthouse door from its hinges as he fought his way outside. "Hold on," he shouted into the gale, knowing she couldn't possibly hear him over the storm's roar. The woman had managed to grab hold of a jagged outcropping, but each wave threatened to tear her loose. Marcus secured his rope to the iron railing and rappelled down the cliff face, salt spray stinging his eyes and soaking through his rain slicker. She looked up as he approached, and Marcus nearly lost his grip. Her eyes were the color of deep ocean, but they held flecks of silver that seemed to move independently like tiny stars swimming in midnight water. Despite being battered by waves and bleeding from scrapes across her arms, she watched him descend with an expression of profound curiosity rather than fear. "Can you swim?" Marcus called out, extending the rope toward her. She reached for it, with movements that seemed oddly graceful despite her circumstances, as if she'd spent her life moving through water rather than air. Her fingers were longer than they should be, with translucent webbing barely visible between them in the lightning flashes. Together, they fought their way up the cliff face. The woman moved with surprising strength, but Marcus noticed she kept her eyes fixed on him rather than the treacherous rocks, as though she'd never seen anything quite like a middle-aged lighthouse keeper, with a graying beard and worried expression. Inside the lighthouse, Marcus immediately went to his emergency supplies. The woman stood dripping in his entryway, wearing what appeared to be a form-fitting garment made from some kind of scaled material that shifted color in the lamplight. She was tall, nearly matching his own height, with the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged in pre-Raphaelite paintings rather than storm-soaked lighthouses. "Here," Marcus said, pulling a thick wool blanket from his supply chest. "You need to get warm before hypothermia sets in." He held out the blanket and she froze completely. For a long moment she simply stared at the offered wool, her silver-flecked eyes widening. Then, with movements so deliberate they seemed ritualistic, she reached out and accepted the blanket, with both hands. She brought it to her chest and closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as if it carried some sacred fragrance. When she opened her eyes again, they glistened with unshed tears. "You offer the cloth of warmth," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent Marcus couldn't place, something that suggested languages older than English, with vowels that seemed to echo. "Without price, without demand, without knowledge of what this means." Marcus blinked. "It's just a blanket. You're soaked and probably going into shock." "Just a..." She wrapped the wool around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe, and suddenly, she looked less like a shipwreck victim and more like some ancient priestess. On Ethros, such an offering would bind 2 souls across lifetimes, the giver's heart freely shared with one in need. Ethros? Marcus rubbed his beard, water still dripping from his rain slicker. "That's not a place I've heard of. Are you from one of the research vessels? There's been talk of new oceanographic surveys." Leanna, though he didn't know her name yet, tilted, her head with that same curious expression she'd worn while drowning. "You speak of vessels that sail upon water. I come from deeper currents." She moved toward his window, the blanket flowing around her like royal vestment. Outside, lightning continued to strobe across the churning sea, but she seemed to be looking beyond the storm, toward something Marcus couldn't perceive. "My name is Lyanna Thorne," she said finally. "I was, keeper of the deep archives on Ethros. Until I learned what your people call kindness, and became something my world could no longer contain. Marcus poured hot coffee from his thermos, adding extra sugar before offering it to her. Again, she received the cup with that same reverential care as though he'd just presented her with liquid gold. Kindness, she repeated, tasting the word along with the coffee. On my world, survival depends on calculated exchange. Resources are finite, trust is rationed, and every gesture carries precise value. When I stumbled upon your species' radio transmissions, she paused, sipping the coffee with obvious pleasure. I heard people giving without measuring, helping, without accounting, loving without limits. It seemed impossible. And that's why you're here, to study human kindness? Marcus settled into his reading chair, still trying to process what she was telling him. That's quite a research project. Lyanna turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the sea, she smiled. It transformed, her entire face turning her from ethereal to radiant. I didn't come to study it, she said. I came to learn it, but my departure was noticed. The Council of Ethros considers kindness a dangerous contamination. They've sent someone to retrieve me. As if summoned by her words, a sound cut through the storm, not thunder, but something deeper and more resonant. The lighthouse windows rattled in their frames, and Marcus's emergency radio crackled to life with bursts of static that formed almost patterns, like language trying to emerge from chaos. Lyanna set down her coffee cup with hands that had begun to tremble. He's found me. Who's found you? Commander Vex. He's efficient, single-minded, everything my people value. She looked at Marcus with those impossible eyes. He won't understand what you've done for me. The offering of warmth, of sustenance, of shelter with no thought of return. It will seem like madness to him. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but the strange resonant sound grew stronger. Marcus could feel it in his bones now, a vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Will he hurt you? Marcus asked. Not hurt, Lyanna said quietly. Heal. He'll try to cure me of the contamination, return me to proper, Etherian thinking. Calculated, measured, safe. She touched the wool blanket still draped around her shoulders. But I can't unknow what I've learned. I can't unfeel what you've shown me. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, but now it illuminated something impossible in the clearing sky. A shape that defied perspective, neither ship nor aircraft, hovering above the waves like geometry given malevolent purpose. Marcus. Rivera, lighthouse keeper, protector of ships and souls, looked at the woman he'd saved from the storm and made a decision that would change everything. Then we don't let him take you, he said simply. Lyanna stared at him, and for the second time that night tears gathered in her eyes. You would protect me? At risk to yourself? For no gain? Marcus smiled, feeling older than his 42 years, but somehow more alive than he'd been in decades. Lady, where I come from, that's not called risk. That's called being human. Outside, Commander Vex descended through the clearing storm, and Marcus Rivera prepared to teach another alien the true meaning of kindness, whether they wanted to learn or not. The price of kindness. The impossible vessel settled onto the lighthouse platform like a geometric nightmare folding itself into reality. Marcus had seen plenty of strange things during his years keeping the beacon. Ghost ships in fog, unexplained, lights beneath the waves, even what the Coast Guard officially called weather phenomena, but privately whispered about in darker terms. Nothing had prepared him for something that looked like a crystalline cathedral, crossed with a military gunship. Lyanna pressed closer to the window, the wool blanket clutched around her shoulders like armor. He's alone, she murmured, relief and worry warring in her voice. That means he still considers this a simple retrieval. Simple? Marcus checked the locks on his door out of pure human instinct, knowing they'd be useless against whatever technology had just landed on his lighthouse. He's chasing you across space because you learned to be nice to people. Not learned, Lyanna corrected, her reflection ghost-like in the storm-cleaned glass. Felt. On Ethros, we understand kindness conceptually. We know it exists in other species as a survival mechanism, but we can't experience it. Our neural pathways don't form those connections. A sound like crystal bells mixed with grinding metal announced the visitor's approach. Marcus peered through the window and immediately wished he hadn't. Commander. Vex stood 7 feet tall, his form humanoid but stretched and refined like someone had taken a person and carved away everything soft or imperfect. His skin held the same translucent quality as Liana's, but was shot through with veins of silver that pulsed with their own light. He wore no obvious clothing, instead seeming to be sheathed in liquid metal that flowed and shifted as he moved. But it was his face that made Marcus step back from the window. Perfect features, mathematically precise, with eyes like chips of Arctic ice. Everything about him radiated cold intelligence and absolute certainty. Liana of the Deep Archives, Vex's voice carried clearly through the lighthouse walls, though Marcus couldn't see his lips move. You will present yourself for remedial processing. Remedial processing, Marcus repeated grimly. That doesn't sound friendly. It isn't meant to be, Liana said. She turned from the window and Marcus was struck by how different she looked now. No longer the ethereal refugee he'd pulled from the waves, but someone preparing for battle. Vex doesn't understand concepts like mercy or rehabilitation. Problems are solved, errors are corrected, anomalies are eliminated. The lighthouse door didn't open so much as simply cease to exist. One moment it was there, solid oak reinforced. With iron bands, the next there was an empty doorframe through which Commander Vex stepped with fluid precision. He surveyed the lighthouse interior with those crystalline eyes, taking in Marcus's simple furnishings, the emergency supplies, the half-empty coffee pot. When his gaze fell on the wool blanket around Liana's shoulders, he stopped completely. Explain, he said, the single word carrying enough authority to make Marcus's teeth ache. This human offered aid without calculation, Liana replied, lifting her chin with defiant dignity. He shared resources, provided shelter, asked nothing in return. Vex turned his attention to Marcus, who felt like a mouse being studied by a particularly intellectual hawk. You gave material goods to an unknown entity during a crisis situation. What did you expect to receive in exchange? Nothing, Marcus said honestly. She was drowning. I helped her. That's what decent people do. Decent. Vex tested the word like it might bite him. Define this concept. Marcus glanced at Liana, who nodded encouragingly. It means doing the right thing because it's right, not because you get something out of it. Inefficient, Vex declared. Resources expended without guaranteed return constitute strategic failure. This behavior indicates either severe cognitive dysfunction or sophisticated deception. Or, Liana said quietly, it indicates exactly what I've been trying to explain to the Council. This species has developed something we lost millennia ago. The ability to value others as much as themselves. Vex's silver veins pulsed brighter. Impossible. Evolutionary pressure eliminates such waste. Marcus felt his temper rising, the way it did when tourists dismissed his lighthouse as obsolete or when government inspectors questioned his maintenance reports. Waste? Lady, if caring about other people is waste, then I'm proud to be inefficient. Stepped between Vex and Liana, fully aware of how ridiculous he must look. A middle-aged human in a rain-soaked sweater facing down what was essentially a living weapon. She doesn't want to go with you. Want is irrelevant, Vex replied. Liana suffers from neurological contamination. Treatment will restore proper cognitive function. And if she refuses treatment? For the first time, Vex's perfect features showed something approaching emotion, confusion. Refusal is not a recognized response to medical necessity. It is here, Marcus said firmly. On this world, people get to choose their own medical care and their own lives. Vex looked from Marcus to Liana and back again, his crystalline eyes narrowing. You would interfere with the recovery of damaged Etherian property? Property? Marcus's voice rose dangerously. She's a person, not a broken tool. Incorrect. Citizens of Ethros serve designated functions. When malfunction occurs, repair protocols are implemented. Liana touched Marcus's shoulder gently. He truly doesn't understand, she said. On our world, individual identity exists only as it serves collective efficiency. The concept of personal autonomy is alien to them. Then, maybe it's time they learn something new, Marcus said. He turned to face Vex directly. You want to know about human inefficiency? Fine. I'll show you. Before either alien could react, Marcus pulled the emergency flare gun from his supply kit and fired it directly at the lighthouse lens above them. The brilliant red flare exploded against the carefully calibrated mirrors, sending fragments of light scattering in every direction and effectively destroying the beacon he'd maintained for over 2 decades. Vex stared at the ruined lens mechanism with obvious shock. You have damaged critical infrastructure. This serves no logical purpose. Exactly, Marcus said, setting down the flare gun. I just destroyed something precious to me for no practical reason except to make a point. That's the kind of beautiful, ridiculous, wonderfully human thing your efficiency calculations can't account for. This proves only that your species suffers from widespread cognitive dysfunction, Vex replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Does it? Liana stepped forward, the wool blanket sliding from her shoulders. Or does it prove that some things matter more than logic? Marcus destroyed his life's work to demonstrate a principle. That's not dysfunction, that's faith. Vex's silver veins pulsed in rapid, irregular patterns. Faith is statistical error, belief without supporting data. Faith, Marcus said quietly, is what makes us willing to pull strangers out of storms. It's what makes us share our last blanket with someone who needs it more. It's what makes us stand up to impossible odds when we know we can't win. Inefficient, Vex repeated, but the word sounded hollow now. Inefficient, Liana agreed, and irreplaceable. Commander, I've felt what it's like to trust without guarantees, to give without measuring, to hope without certainty. I can't return to the old calculations. Vex was quiet for a long moment, his crystalline eyes reflecting the scattered light from the broken lens. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note Marcus hadn't heard before, something almost like curiosity. The contamination has progressed beyond remedial parameters, he said finally. Standard protocols, insufficient. Then don't use standard protocols, Marcus suggested. Vex looked at him sharply. Alternative approaches require improvisation. Welcome to being human, Marcus said with a slight smile. We make it up as we go along. The commander stood silent, his perfect features cycling through expressions that seemed to surprise even him. Finally, he turned to Liana. The council will not understand this decision, he said. Probably not, Liana agreed. Will you try to make them? Vex looked at the wool blanket lying on the floor, then at Marcus's ruined lighthouse lens, then at the 2 beings who had somehow managed to confuse his entire worldview in the span of 20 minutes. I will attempt inefficiency, he said carefully. This constitutes the first deliberate strategic error in my operational history. How does it feel? Marcus asked. Vex considered the question with obvious bewilderment. Uncertain, uncomfortable, strangely liberating. Liana laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with ocean waves. Welcome to kindness, Commander. It's terrifying and wonderful and completely illogical. And worth it, Marcus added, looking at his destroyed life's work without regret. Always worth it. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of hope and new beginnings. 3 beings who had nothing in common except their capacity for change stood together in the ruins of certainty, learning what it meant to choose faith over logic, kindness over efficiency, and each other over the familiar darkness of isolation. The lighthouse beam was broken, but somehow the light remained.